Hi. I think we're ready to get started. I'd like to begin tonight by thanking all of you for coming out. It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces and so many new faces, and tonight's going to be a great event. My name is Jennifer Derr, and I am the founding director of the Center for the Middle East and North Africa here at UC Santa Cruz, and I want to take this opportunity to welcome you on behalf of the center's community and also on behalf of the Humanities Institute. Welcome you to tonight's event. Before I introduce our distinguished speaker, I'd like to take a moment and to consider the place that we're in and the land that we stand on. And specifically, I would like to acknowledge that the land on which we gather is the unceded territory of the Awaswas-speaking Yupi tribe. The Emma-Mutsun tribal band, comprised of the descendants of indigenous people taken to Mission Santa Cruz and San Juan Bautista during Spanish colonization of the Central Coast, is today working hard to restore traditional stewardship practices on these lands and to heal from historical trauma. Now, it is my deep pleasure to introduce Reza Azlan. Reza Azlan is a renowned writer, commentator, professor, Emmy and Peabody nominated producer, and also a scholar of religions. A recipient of the prestigious James Joyce Award, Aslan is the author of 3 internationally best-selling books, including the #1 New York Times bestseller, Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth. His producing credits include the acclaimed HBO series The Leftovers and the hit CBS comedy United States of AI. He was the host and executive producer of CNN's Believer and also Rough Draft with Reza Azlan, as well as co-host along with Rainn Wilson of the podcast Metaphysical Milkshakes. Aslan's first book, No God But God, The Origins, Evolution, and Future of Islam, has been translated into 20 languages and was named one of the 100 most important books of the last decade by Blackwell Publishers. He is also the author of Beyond Fundamentalism, Confronting Religious Extremism in a Globalized Age, as well as the editor of 2 volumes, Tablet and Pen, Literary Landscapes from the Modern Middle East, and Muslims and Jews in America, Commonalities, Contentions, and Complexities. Tonight, we have gathered to discuss his most recent book, which is entitled An American Martyr in Persia, The Epic Life and the Tragic Death of Howard Baskerville. And this was nominated for the Penn-Jacqueline Beograd Weld Award for Biography. I also want to announce that the book will be available in Persian and will be open access beginning this April. So before we start today, please join me in welcoming Reza Azlan.
Wow, what a great crowd and what an awesome location. This barn is very, very cool. And as I was explaining to Jennifer, it even smells like a barn. So that's
in the nice way.
In a
right?
nice way.
In the nice
yes,
way.
in the nice way. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. This is great. Notice that I not only got to introduce our speaker, but I have savvily put myself on stage next to him, coincidentally. I have had the pleasure of reading this book, and I'm very excited to talk about it, especially as a historian of the modern Middle East. But I want to start with just a quick question so that we can set up this project. So I'm interested, this is a crazy story that we're going to hear about tonight. This is a story that ends up with an American Protestant missionary being the second command of a revolutionary fighter in an Iranian revolution in the early 20th century, okay? So this is, when I started this book, I had no idea this is where we were going. And so I think it would be great if you could tell us how you happened upon this story, what the process of discovery was, how you started to think about this as an important story.
Well, first of all, thank you, everybody. It's such a joy to be here. The truth is that when I was a kid growing up in Iran in the 70s, everybody knew who Howard Baskerville was. There were streets named after Howard Baskerville. There were schools named after Howard Baskerville. There was like a very awesome like high school auditorium not far from my neighborhood that was named after Baskerville. He was taught in schools the story of this American Christian missionary from Nebraska who came to Iran in 1907 in order to preach the gospel and teach English, and then who ended up not just fighting alongside his students in the first revolution in Iran, the first of 3 revolutions of the 20th century in Iran, but who ended up dying this kind of heroic death. His tomb is still in Tabriz, the city in which he lived and he died. For decades after his death, his tomb was a pilgrimage site. People would come from all over the country on the anniversary of his death, which is April 21st, and would, lay flowers at the gravesite. And so the name Baskerville was just kind of a name that was just ever present, right? I don't know if I could have told you as a kid anything about Howard Baskerville other than what I just mentioned, that some Christian kid who came to America and fought, But he really had this place in the Persian consciousness that Lafayette has in the American consciousness, right? The foreigner who fought in another country's revolution. Although Baskerville, not as good of a rapper. So it was just kind of, and again, I don't know if anyone here, again, could really tell you that much about Lafayette other than, all right, that French guy, and he fought, and he came here, and he fought with us, and yeah, that's right. That's kind of that story. And so in 1978-79, when the third of those 3 revolutions of the 20th century happened in Iran, the name Baskerville resurfaced. I was 7 years old, and so that name became really prominent again, and a lot of the kind of revolutionary thinkers would use Baskerville as kind of the model for what America should be, what America should look like. There's a great essay written by one of 20th century Iran's greatest Persian poets and writers, Reza Azlan. And he wrote an essay in The Nation, the liberal magazine in the United States. And the title of the essay was, "Where Are Today's Baskervilles?" And it was this appeal, I think it was written in 78. It was this appeal to the American people that, here we are again, once again fighting a revolution for our freedoms against another tyrant, and the sort of the memory of Howard Baskerville has been lost to Americans. Where are the American Baskervilles? And then he had this line in there that I actually quote in the book, which was, the truth is that if Baskerville were alive today and part of this revolution today, he'd be fighting against his fellow Americans. And it was this real kind of diatribe against the way that America was thinking about Iran and that part of the world. And then, when the revolution happened, my family fled and came to the United States, and I just assumed that everybody in America knew who Howard Baskerville was, or at least, knew more than I did about him. After all, he's an American. He's a hero in Iran. He must be a hero in America. And literally no one had heard about this kid. I mean, he'd been completely wiped from the consciousness of Americans. And as I discovered in my research, kind of deliberately so, actually, very deliberately removed from the story of 20th century America. And then I just kind of forgot too, and I grew up in this country, and it wasn't easy being an Iranian in America, certainly not in the early 80s when in the middle of the hostage crisis and, the enmity that was forming between the United States and Iran. I've mentioned numerous times that I spent a good part of the 1980s telling people I was Mexican. I would just tell everybody I was Mexican because I didn't understand that Americans didn't also like Mexicans. I just thought I was like, oh, I'm Mexican. Wait, oh, you hate Mexicans too? But it was about, I guess in my 30s, I'd kind of started my career and started writing about things, and the story of Baskerville just sort of popped up again every once in a while. Usually on the anniversary of his death, somebody would write some kind of essay somewhere. But it was always the same thing. It was always 1,000 words, and it always just said the same thing. He was a Christian missionary. He was 22 years old. He went to Iran in 1907, teach English, preach the gospel, ended up fighting and dying in a revolution. And that was it. So it never occurred to me to kind of write a book about him because it seemed like that's all anyone knew about him was just that basic outline. And then I just kind of made this, it's a long story of how the book finally came about, but when I decided to sit down and write this, my first real challenge was, is there anything more to know about this kid other than, these basic facts? Because that's going to be a very short book. And I got really lucky. I found this amazing research assistant who was fluent in English and Persian and Russian, and who just dove into the archives and found in Persian and also in Russian, because Russia played a very important role in this revolution, this kind of treasure trove of material that just kind of brought this kid to life. And then I just knew at that point that I had to write this book to remind people, both in Iran and in America, who this kid was and why he was worth knowing.
So I'm going to put a bookmark right there because I want to come back to your sources. There's some amazing sources in this book. But before we do that, I'd like you to tell us a bit about the constitutional revolution in Iran, right? So this was this incredibly important moment in the early 20th century that comes in a global moment of a wave of constitutional revolutions. But within Iran itself, it was significant in its time, and it's had this continuing resonance. And so I was wondering if you could talk about that.
Yeah, the constitutional revolution. So it begins in 1905. It's the first democratic revolution in the Middle East. This is a remarkable moment in which these sort of very young, fairly well-educated, urbanized mostly, Iranians, men and women, start pouring onto the streets and to ask for these two fundamental rights. What they want, first and foremost, is a constitution. They want the laws of the land to actually be written down, not just be whatever the government representative in front of you tells you the law is. A document that actually lays out the rights and privileges of every citizen in this country. And then they also wanted a parliament. They wanted an independent legislature that would have not just the ability to curb the unchecked power of the Shah, but to have the ability to actually write new laws, to actually create these laws. And it's not a big ask, but it was quite revolutionary at the time. And as you rightly say, although it was the first of these, it was also part of this thing that happened in the first couple of decades of the 20th century, where you had similar revolutions taking place in China and in Mexico and in Russia. These revolutions that are all asking for the same thing, a constitution. And so we call them sort of the constitutional revolutions of the time. But the thing that's really funny about it is that no one really knew what the term itself actually meant. Like, what do you mean, what is a constitution anyway? I mean, we want one, but what is it again? Like, what? And the nice thing about the term is that it could really mean whatever you wanted it to mean. So for the poor, constitutionalism meant financial equity. For the educated, it meant independence from the mandates of the state. For religious minorities, it meant protection from oppression. And this kind of became this umbrella term that began to bring all these disparate groups together, fighting for a single cause, which is what we now would just simply term as popular sovereignty. The ability to have a say in the decisions that control your life. Again, not a big ask. It's not asking for a lot. I would just like a say in these decisions. And you saw these revolutions happening all over the place. But the one in Iran was remarkable for a couple of reasons, not least because it was first. It was sort of the model that a lot of these other revolutions started to look at. But it was also remarkable because it had brought in the clerical class, the mullahs, who, this requires a little bit of a backstory here, but in Shia Islam, so Islam has two major branches, right? There's the majority Sunni branch, and then that has 500 branches, and then there's the minority Shia branch, and that has a bunch of other branches. But the difference between the two has to do with where authority rests. And so in Sunni Islam, the authority rests in the text, and then the imams, the ulama, they're the interpreters of the text. So they get their authority because they interpret the text for you. But in Shia Islam, the authority rests in the actual clerics. And there's like a level that you can achieve, the highest of which is the Grand Ayatollah. And what that means is that, yes, of course, you read the text, you interpret the Quran and all that stuff, but that's not where your authority rests. You have the ability to make judgments, to make declarations that have the weight of kind of religious mandate, even if they're not in the Quran. You can just kind of decide for yourself what they are. And it allows for Shiism to be much more malleable. It allows it to evolve and develop and branch into all kinds of different ways. But one of the things that it's also done is that it's created a situation in which the religious class, the clerical class, has more or less divorced itself from direct political participation, right? They didn't, for most of the 1400 years in which Shiism has existed, the clerics, the mullahs, have deliberately divorced themselves from politics. They don't take part in the political world. And there's a very interesting theological explanation for this that I have to do.
I'm definitely not going to let you do that.
You're not going to let me do it. Okay,
No.
that's good. Good. I've already told her not to let me go off.
I'm going to pull you back to the early 20th
But
century.
so what happened was, this was the first time in which the mullahs actually inserted themselves into politics on behalf of the revolutionaries. They started issuing all these fatwas, these declarative judgments, saying that support for the revolution is mandated by God. That, this is what we all have to do. So it became this kind of massive groundswell of support. And it was, as Lenin very famously termed it, the most successful anti-imperialist movement of the 20th century at the time. And indeed, Lenin actually told his Bolshevik followers, you want to make a difference? Go to Iran. Go and join that revolution. And they did.
Yeah. Okay, so we're in Iran. There's been a constitutional revolution. There's a new majlis, a new representative body formed. Much of this activity is going on in Tehran. Help us bring Howard Baskerville into this story. Right. He comes from a very particular world of American Protestant missionary activity. How does he end up in Tabriz during this moment?
I mean, he is the grandchild of what we call the Second Great Awakening, which is this kind of religious movement that took place in the United States in the latter half of the 1800s, which gave birth to what we now refer to as evangelical Christianity, the dominant form of religious expression in the United States. And what was unique about evangelical Christianity is that it rejected the Puritan notion of let's build an America that is the new Jerusalem. You know, that was kind of the foundation of the Puritan ethos, right? That this is the new Jerusalem and we need to like make this a perfected Christian nation. Evangelicals were like, I mean, okay, but what about everywhere else? You know, let's go, okay, great, America, fantastic. Let's go convert the rest of the planet. Like and the further and more exotic the location, the better. And so wave after wave of these new Protestant evangelical missionaries began going to like Syria and India and Japan and, you know, Egypt, all these sort of places. And one of the major outlets for this movement happened to be not just Iran, but one particular area of Iran, the northwestern part of Iran, the main city of which was this city called Tabriz. And so by the time Howard Baskerville, he graduates from Princeton in 1907. He's the son and grandson of Presbyterian preachers from Nebraska and South Dakota. He gets a degree in Christian ministry. The expectation is, okay, you're done. Like, come back to Nebraska, come back to South Dakota, and take up a preaching job. But he decides he wants to have like an adventure first, right? He's brimming with this excitement, this new evangelical fervor, and he wants to go and preach the gospel to like the darkest corners of the world before he comes back. He doesn't want to go to Iran. That's absolutely for sure. In fact, in his application letter, he makes it very clear. He's like, I was talking to Jesus, and Jesus thinks I should go to China. But we've already got a lot of missionaries in China, so we're sending you to Iran. And the thing that you need to understand is that at that time, the way that these missionaries were talking about Iran, or Persia, as it was called back then, was like the most backward, scariest, darkest place on earth. These like missionary reports that were coming back that I quote in the book and that Baskerville was reading talk about Iran. My favorite one is one by Justin Perkins where he says, all the sins of the Decalogue are ever present in Persia, and add to that the ever greater sin of Sodom. Jesus, like, it's like, you know, they would talk about the solid wall of Mohammedanism that is unbreakable, you know, and all this stuff. And so he gets assigned to Persia. He does not want to go. Like, he tries to get out of it. But, you know, God says you have to go to Persia, you go to Persia. And so he goes there kicking and screaming. It takes him 3 months to get there, which is crazy, right? That was travel back, you know. It was like, I'm going to Persia. It'll take me 3 months to arrive. And then he gets there and immediately falls in love with the place. Like, everything that he was told was a lie. He just loves the people. He loves the culture, falls in love with the food. I mean, of course, he's like from Nebraska. Of course he falls in love with the food. I mean, it's the best food. Can we all agree on that part? Yes? Okay. I just want to make sure we all are on the same page there. Becomes instantly the most popular teacher in his school, which is not hard. He's the youngest. He's the only one not married. And just is having the time of his life. And it's a really kind of this beautiful story, right, of this kind of conversion on his part, where he went to this place that he thought was like dark and foreign and evil, and almost instantly makes it home.
So it's funny. So we're now in Tabriz, right? Baskerville has arrived in Tabriz. He's teaching at this school. He's falling in love with the place. But then there's a process by which he begins to consider politics and revolution outside of the frame of the national, right? He begins to identify with this form of revolutionary politics. And I'd love it if you could narrate that for us.
Sure. So he arrives in 1907, and we told you that the revolution started in 1905. So the revolution starts in 1905. In 1906, it works. It succeeds. They win. They force the Shah, at the time a man by the name of Muzaffar ad-Din, to sign a constitution, and it's quite a modern document. It outlines freedom of speech, it outlines freedom of religion, it outlines freedom of thought. It's a remarkable document that is written and signed off by the Shah, and he allows for the creation of a parliament. They actually have the first elections, and now they have Iran is a constitutional monarchy in 1906. And then a few days after he signs the constitution, the Shah dies. And the new Shah, his son, is this 35-year-old man by the name of Muhammad Ali. Not that Muhammad Ali, different Muhammad Ali. I sometimes kind of say, look, we've had some real sons of bitches sitting on that throne in Iran, but this guy just takes the cake. Muhammad Ali was raised to believe that the throne was his birthright. He was raised to believe that God had made him Shah. And he was incensed with his father for having deigned to kind of give up, some measure of that authority to these pointy-headed intellectuals. And from the very beginning, worked tirelessly to undermine the constitutional movement. At first, behind the scenes, he, in a very sort of stupid and awkward and ham-fisted way, like for instance, at one point, he paid a large group of prostitutes to march through Tehran, chanting, "The Constitution has given us the freedom to do what we want with our bodies." But it didn't work because a lot of people recognized the prostitutes. They were like, "Oh, I've seen her before." It was like stupid things like that. But then, by about 1907, the middle of 1907, Muhammad Ali gets this very powerful ally in his attempts to do away with constitutionalism, and that ally is the Tsar of Russia, who in 1905 experienced his own constitutional revolution, and who also said, fine, here's a constitution, fine, you can have a Duma, and it ended up that the people weren't appeased, and so then he just killed everybody. And for the Tsar, I think he kind of learned this lesson, which is, no, if you listen to people and their demands, they'll just keep asking for more. And having violently quelled his own revolution, wanted to make sure that another revolution just like it wasn't successful on his southern border. And at that time, of course, the Iranian military was funded by, weaponized by, armed by, trained by, and commanded by Russians. So the soldiers were Iranian, but the commanders were Russian. And so he made it very clear to the Shah, if you want this relationship to continue, it's time to put an end to this, democratic experiment. And the Shah, was kind of a spineless character, but the Tsar basically said, I'll do it for you. Okay, you just sit there and be quiet, and my people will make it happen. And sure enough, over the next 5 or 6 months or so of 1907, the early and middle part of 1907, the Shah's Russian-trained troops went from Tehran, city by city, province by province, destroying the revolutionaries and uprooting the revolution. The first thing that they did was they rolled all these Russian-made cannons to the House of Parliament in Tehran, and they blew it up with the parliamentarians inside. They were literally in the middle of a session. And that was the first moment in which people realized, oh, this is a counter-revolution. So by the fall of 1907, the Shah had managed to regain control over every part of Iran, every city, every province, except one. And that was the city of Tabriz, way up in the northwest. And right at that moment is when Baskerville arrived in Tabriz. So he shows up in this city. He's having a great time. He loves his students. They love him. He's having all this great adventure, everything that he dreamed that this would be. And at the same time, revolutionaries from the rest of Iran are flooding into Tabriz for safety, because this is sort of the last bastion. This is the last stand for this revolution. So he is caught in the middle of this, revolutionary moment, at the heart of it, at the center of it. And then, a lot of his students were involved in the revolution. A lot of their family members were involved in the revolution. It was very hard for him not to be engaged. But to the point that you were making, over and over again, he is being told by the school, the missionary school that employs him, by the Protestant mission that sent him there to begin with, and by the US government that controls his actions, that this is none of your business. None of this is your business. You cannot have anything to do with what's happening here. The school has to maintain total neutrality. The church can't have its missionaries involved in foreign revolutions. That would be the end of the missionary process. Like how would the Tsar of Russia allow any Christian missionaries in its country if one of them might take up arms against him? You cannot have anything to do with this. And the US government, which from the very beginning had declared neutrality in this conflict, not because they had some vested interest in Iran like they do today. There was no oil back then, remember. The oil had not been discovered yet. So America didn't give a shit about Iran, couldn't care less about it. But because, as the State Department wrote in a memo to the mission in Tabriz, the notion of democracy arising in a Muslim country is so absurd that it's laughable. There is no possibility for this revolution to succeed. And it's a joke to think that it could. There has never been democracy in a Mohammedan country, and so there never will be. So the United States can't possibly take sides in this conflict. And then also, the British and the Russians, which were allies, were very much on the side of the Shah, so the US didn't want to ruffle any feathers. And so over and over again, Baskerville was told, it's not your business, it's not your business, it's not your business. And then in 1908, and this is where I'll kind of pause this, and then in 1908, the Shah's troops finally arrive. Right? They've been cleansing the revolution from city to city to city to city, and they finally arrive to Tabriz. Tabriz at this point is very well defended. They knew they were coming. It's got walls. All the revolutionaries from all the other places are living now in Tabriz. And then they've also being joined by the Russians and Armenians and Turks, and everyone has come here at this kind of last stand against the Shah. And the Shah's forces decide, rather than try to attack the city and take it by force, which would be very, very difficult, they'll just surround the city and starve it to death. And that's what happens in 1908. It's the famine of Tabriz, or the siege of Tabriz, as it's called, still in Iranian history books. It's one of the most horrific moments in the 20th century. Thousands and thousands of Tabrizis starve and die on the street. And it's at that moment that the constant refrain of not your business, not your business, not your business just doesn't work anymore. And Baskerville has this kind of, really this sort of psychic break, and he just can't continue doing what he's doing anymore.
I feel like I just got a signal from you that I should not tell people how this ends.
It is called an American martyr.
Yeah, there is a tragic death.
I will say, can I give a coda to this? Because there's one thing so Baskerville, I don't want to make it sound as though his fellow missionaries didn't care about what was happening. It's really important because they did. These are people who had given up their lives to come to Iran. Again, this isn't like a 2-month missionary trip that you do. This is, you leave your world and now you live in this world and you have kids there, right? Their children called themselves Persian. Their children didn't call themselves American. They loved these people. They absolutely suffered alongside with them. And they did everything that they could to feed the population, to care for the population. But the idea that they would directly involve themselves in the revolution itself was anathema to everything that they were doing there, right? And it would have been such a threat to the missionary impulse because that was what they were there for. And as awful as this sounds, it was a refrain that they would say all the time. We are here to save souls, not lives. We are here to save souls. We're not here to save lives. And it sounds awful, but they truly loved the people and they did everything that they could to alleviate the humanitarian situation. But for Baskerville, for this 24-year-old kid, that didn't make sense to him, right? This idea that it was like not their business. It's like, we live here. This is our people. This is our community. Like, we either have these values and these beliefs and we either fight for them or we don't. And what was even more awkward for him is that the school had a teacher who was teaching international law, jurisprudence and international law, international relations. And that teacher was a member of the revolution, and that teacher was captured, and he was very slowly and painfully tortured to death by the Shah's troops. And now those students didn't have a teacher, and the administration didn't know what to do, so they had Baskerville teach his class. So now Baskerville, every day, is sitting in front of his classroom talking about constitutionalism and international relations and government responsibility. He's basically preaching democracy to kids who are dying for it after class. And it was just too much. He had basically like what we would refer to nowadays as a nervous breakdown. And so one day, very famously, he steps in front of his classroom and he says, the quotation is, "I can no longer stand idly by while the people that I have come to serve are dying on the streets." And he, right then and there, quits his job, quits his mission, and says, "I'm going to go join the revolution." And then in this like absolutely made for like Hollywood moment, his students stand up and join him, and everyone leaves the classroom and goes straight to the battlefield. And it's such a it's this moment where like the humanity of him finally breaks through all the limitations that the people who told him who he was. The American government said, "You're American, it's not your country, it's not your business." The church was saying, "You're here to preach the gospel. You're here to save souls, not lives. None of your business." The school was saying, "We pay you to teach. That's what you were here to do. That's what your business is. It's not your business." And that sense of like his humanity breaking through all of that and making this incredible, like faithful decision as a 23-year-old kid. Like this is a remarkable person.
So I want to pick up right there. And you know, there's a romance to this story, okay, right? There's a lot of romance to this story in various forms. But one form is that, as you said, in the context of this revolution, Tabriz was the most radical site of this revolution, right? It's also an incredibly diverse city. So one of the historical dynamics that we see unfold is that Tabriz's different ethnic, linguistic, and religious communities come together and fight. Another dynamic that we see is it's not only Baskerville fighting with the revolutionaries. As you alluded to, people are coming from Russia, people are coming from other parts of Central Asia, right? This is the Spanish Civil War of its time, right?
Yeah.
In the small city of Tabriz. And so, it begs the question. There is a lesson here about international solidarity, politics beyond the nation. It must have been in your mind when you were writing this book.
Absolutely. So, hi. There I am. So halfway.
Wait.
Am I doing something wrong? All right. Oh, hello. Okay. So halfway during the siege. So there's a whole other part of this story, which is this revolutionary army inside of Tabriz has this absolutely legendary commander, this like illiterate horse trader by the name of Sattar Khan, who is just like in the pantheon of Iranian figures of the 20th century, like God level. This is an amazing character, and so fun to write about. So Sattar Khan, in the middle of this siege, has his revolutionary army issue this thing called the National Manifesto. It's basically a letter that the revolutionaries write in the midst of this siege and that they send to the capitals of the world, the capitals of Europe, the capitals of Asia, to the United States. And the document is remarkable, but there's this one passage in it that I quote in the book that's amazing to the point that you're making, and it says, if you open the heart of a Japanese person, does it not look like the heart of a British man? If you open the heart of an Iranian, doesn't it look like the heart of a Russian? Put aside the bigotry of creeds and the prejudice of nationalism and come to our aid, because what we are fighting for is the human condition. This isn't about like Iranian or whatever. Like, this is about the human cause. And this document just lights a fire across the world. This is the document that Lenin reads and sends a missive to his Bolsheviks, get to Tabriz. The Armenians start to show up, and the Armenians are like these very well-trained fighters. They bring all this like bomb-making technology with them. The Turks, who are just about to fight their own revolution, they start to show up. There's people coming from all over the world. So it is truly this like international anti-imperialist cause. But amongst that like multicultural dynamic, people speaking different languages, different religions, different ethnicities, different parts of the world, all united under this sort of cause of anti-imperialism, there's just one American. And in 1909, like in 2023, that's when we start to care. Like, we don't care that there's like Russians and Armenians and Turks and like Kurds and people from all over the world. And no, the second an American shows up, now it's international news. And when Baskerville joined this revolution, it was on the front page of the New York Times. It was on the front page of the London Independent. It was front page news everywhere because that was a shock. And it became a real embarrassment for the United States government and for the Presbyterian Church. Very famously, by the way, the Presbyterian mission tried very hard to talk Baskerville out of this decision to join the revolution. It didn't work. They sent the American consul general to confront him on the battlefield as a representative of the U.S. government. And the consul general basically threatens Baskerville with treason, says, you are violating your oath as an American in fighting a foreign nation's war. And if you do not stop, then we're gonna take you back, and we're gonna put you in prison. And Baskerville, in this very famous moment, this is actually the most famous quote of Baskerville's. It's the one that, like, anybody who knows Baskerville knows this quote. Baskerville looks at this sea of faces from all over the world, and he says, the only difference between me and these people is the place of my birth. and that is a very small difference. And then he hands over his passport and gives up his American citizenship. So it's a remarkable moment. So to this idea of like, this notion of like what we now call transnationalism and globalism, these things did not exist in 1909. Like the argument against Baskerville joining, the argument that people kept making is, this isn't your country. These aren't your people. Like, why would you do this? It doesn't make any sense. And the notion that Baskerville was saying, what does country have to do with it? like there's either democracy or not, either freedom or not. Like, what does it matter because someone put lines around you?
Well, and this is a really fascinating moment. I'm just going to try to slip something in before opening this up. But, I think something that's really artful about the book is Baskerville went to Princeton, and you spend a significant portion of the early chapters discussing the history of white supremacy and Woodrow Wilson's international project, right? Which makes it very, very clear that the kind of internationalism that Baskerville will become emblematic of is not the internationalism of Woodrow Wilson and Princeton.
Well, and in fact, very early on in this book, I started thinking to myself, oh, shit, am I writing a white savior book? Oh,
yeah.
Am I? I mean, he's literally a white savior. Like, he's there to save souls. Is that what I'm doing? And I got really nervous about it because you're right. He comes from this Wilsonian notion that the primary responsibility of the American is to Americanize the rest of the world, right? For good, that's what he meant. It was like bring democracy to the rest of the world. But he meant like turn the rest of the world into America. And what he had spent, a decade doing as president of Princeton was shaping these Princeton graduates and then sending them off into the world. And there's no question that that had an effect on Baskerville's initial decision to not go back to South Dakota, but to go, to the rest of the world and to missionize. But the more I kept writing about this, the more I started realizing that Baskerville's story is like the antithesis of a white savior story. Because when we talk about white saviorism, what we're really referring to is the expression of a privileged person going to a less privileged land and bringing them salvation or civilization without any negotiation as to what the people themselves want or any sort of concern as to their own, cultural or religious identities. And that is who Baskerville was in 1907. He was there to say, well, you're doing it wrong. I'm here to tell you how to do it right, spiritually, civilizationally, educationally, whatever the case may be. But what flips the script is that as he's starting to get to know the students and their families, he starts to ask them, what do you want, right? Not like, I'm here to tell you what you want, but like, what is it that you want? Who are you? What is it that you are striving for? And what they said was, what we don't want, what we don't need is someone else telling us about Jesus. We don't need that. We don't need someone else telling us about, how great American democracy is. Like, we don't need that. You know what we really need? A white person to join us so that people will pay attention. That's what we need. We need an American to pick up a rifle and say, I'm going to fight alongside with you, because then the world will actually pay attention. It doesn't matter how many Russians we have. It doesn't matter how many Armenians we have. It doesn't matter. If we have one American, that changes everything. And he listened. Yeah. And he stopped being there to save, and instead he himself was saved in large part by his actions.
Okay, I'm going to ask you one final question, and then I want to make sure that we open up the floor to questions. And I also want to emphasize that Reza has been very generous and said that he will accept questions from a number of different angles. Exactly. But I did want to close with this final question, which is that this is a really different book than other things that you've written. If one is thinking about the oeuvre, it is a different piece of work. And I wanted to just finish by giving you the opportunity to talk about, how you imagine this book in the bigger work of what you have done.
Yeah. Well, yes, it is a kind of a different book. When I wrote, the book before this was a book called God, A Human History, and that book almost killed me. And when it was finished, I said to myself, I'm never doing this again. I'm never writing like a religion book ever. I'm done. I've got nothing more to say. I wrote a book called God. I'm done. There's nothing more to say. So yes, it is different in that it's not that kind of sort of the fun religious history that people are used to reading from me. But on the other hand, it is kind of the same theme that I have written about over and over and over and over and over again. Because if you really think about it, what animates me as a person, like the kind of people that I am drawn to, both in my life and historically speaking, are people who, when confronted with injustice, activate their faith to do something about it. That is Muhammad. That is Jesus. That is Moses. That's the Buddha. But it's also Howard Baskerville. It's also Nelson Mandela. It's also Martin Luther King. It's the people that I am drawn to are those kinds of people. Because I sort of feel like if I try to model myself as best as possible by that, right? That I just when you're confronted with injustice, you activate your faith and you do something about it. And that's who Baskerville really is to me. It's funny. So after Baskerville joined the revolution, there were all these rumors swirling everywhere, both in D.C., because D.C. was losing its mind. Very funny story. When Baskerville handed over his passport to the American Consul General, he wrote to the State Department and said, I tried. I told him that he needs to leave or we'll arrest him. And he said, okay, here's my passport. What do I do? And the State Department writes a memo to the Presbyterian Board of Foreign Missions, the head of the Presbyterian Board of Foreign Missions, which sent Baskerville to Tabriz. And basically the letter says, come get your boy. It's like we tried, and he gave us his passport. And so, he's your problem. Go and get him before he dies. Go and get him before he dies, because that would be terrible for everyone. And the Presbyterian mission sends back a 4-sentence memo, and it's in the book, and it's hilarious. And the memo says, Howard Baskerville's not one of our missionaries. He's technically a teacher at a missionary school. And so he is not our responsibility. Please don't call us again. And there's this hilarious back and forth memo in the State Department between the Secretary of State and his undersecretary, in which they are like, what the hell does this mean? What is the difference between a missionary and a teacher at a missionary school? He is there to preach the gospel. You paid for him to go, but nobody wanted to have anything to do with this because they truly could not. They didn't have the ability to figure out why he would do this. And so the dominant reason was that he had converted to Islam. They were like, well, he must have converted to Islam. And that was embarrassing enough. Oh my God, we sent a Christian missionary to convert the Muslims to Christianity, and they converted him to Islam. Because that's the only reason that we can think of that he would have done what he did. And Baskerville writes this letter. It's this beautiful letter that he writes to the American consul, basically just explaining himself. It's I don't want there to be any confusion as to what I am doing here. And in that letter, he says 2 things. Number 1, I'm not fighting for a foreign army. Right? If I were fighting for the Shah's forces, then that would be an act of treason against the United States. I'm fighting for these people who are standing up for the thing that we keep preaching, democracy. We keep talking about that. Like, that's what I am fighting for. So you can't accuse me of treason. You can't accuse me of giving up my Americanness. I'm not doing this because I gave up being American. I'm doing this because this is what an American would do. And secondly, I am doing this because this is what Jesus would do. And this is really important because one of the things in my research that I was doing about Baskerville is that he spent, a good 16 of the 18 months that he was in Tabriz preaching the gospel, and I couldn't find any evidence that he had converted a single person. Like, not one. None of his students converted. None of his friends converted. His best friend was a junior mullah, this man by the name of Hassan Sharifzadeh. It just wasn't working at all. And I go through this whole long process of why it doesn't work. Like, preaching the gospel divorced from actions, that doesn't work in most parts of the world, but it certainly doesn't work in Iran. And what he was saying was, in this decision that I have made to leave my missionary post, to stop preaching the gospel and go live the gospel, I am actually fulfilling my duties. So I didn't convert to Islam. This is me being a Christian. I didn't give up being American. This is me being American. And despite the fact that he writes this letter, and it's very clear, people still don't accept it. They don't understand it. They can't fathom the decision. And so they have to put all these different interpretations upon it.
Okay, I think we're going to switch gears now, and I want to make sure that we can open the floor for questions. A few notes about how this will work. We will have several people circulating with microphones, one person circulating with a microphone. Jessica, can you put up your hand so people can see? Jessica is circulating with a microphone. So if you have a question and you can put your hand up, she will walk up to you with the microphone. Please do not speak until you have been given the chosen microphone. It's important for our recording. Jessica.
Hello, thank you for coming. I had a question as to the choice of words or the choice of name that you selected for Iran by using Persia instead of Iran, using the exonym instead of the endonym, because I don't know if many people, I've met a lot of Iranians themselves who don't exactly know the difference. Right. And if you could please give a breakdown to that. And then if I could have a little follow-up question, since you expressed a fascination with people who are drawn on their faith to bring them to action, if you had any insight as to how that plays out with the people who use their faith or used, past tense, their faith, for example, with the Iranian Revolution in 1979.
Okay, Reza, I'm going to have you choose one of those questions because I see we have a number of hands.
Well, the Persia-Iran one is very easy. Iranians have always referred to their homeland as Iran, always. But the country itself wasn't officially called Iran until 1935. The rest of the world referred to it as Persia. Today, the real difference between Iran and Persia is that Persian is a ethnicity and Iranian is a nationality. So you'll hear a lot of people, Iranians will say, I'm Persian, and they're either saying that because they don't want to say Iran because it'll make people scared, or what they really mean is that my ethnicity is Persian, because of course there's a lot of different ethnicities in Iran. You can be Iranian and Kurdish, you can be Iranian and Arab, but the dominant ethnicity is Persian. And just very quickly, look, I think, we talk about the 1979 revolution, we call it the Islamic Revolution, and that is post-revolutionary propaganda. It is bullshit. This was not an Islamic revolution. I was there. Any sociologist will tell you it was the largest revolution of the 20th century. It involved Marxists and communists and liberals and people on the left and the right, the wealthy, the middle class, the poor. It was every sector of society united by this single notion: the Shah must go. But then the Shah went. And what happened next was post-revolutionary chaos, on top of which we had a hostage crisis and an 8-year devastating Iran-Iraq war that started a few months later. So in the middle of a war and a crisis and post-revolutionary chaos, as often happens in revolutions, whether it's Iran or anywhere else, the loudest voice rises to the top. And the loudest voice in post-revolutionary Iran was the voice of Ayatollah Khomeini. And he used that chaos to seize absolute control over the provisional government that was already in place. And he used that control to turn one form of tyranny into a different form of tyranny. And then everything after that it was an Islamic revolution. It was not an Islamic revolution. The purpose of the revolution was not to create the Islamic Republic of Iran. No one had heard the phrase Islamic Republic of Iran until Khomeini issued a referendum. And the referendum, which was a year after the revolution, the referendum, which went to the population, said this: do you want an Islamic Republic? Yes or no? And 96% said yes. That sounds great. I'm not sure what that means. I don't know there's no definition of it. It's just an Islamic Republic? Yeah, I like Islam. I like Republic. Yeah, that sounds great. And it was at that moment that the Vilayat Faqih, which is the political philosophy that allows absolute clerical rule over all aspects of life in Iran, that's when it was born. It wasn't born in 79 or 1978. So it's very important, very important. Just stop. When you call it the Islamic Revolution, you are using the propaganda of the mullahs themselves. Don't talk about it in those terms.
Our next hands.
I was wondering if you could fill in a little bit of the history between Baskerville. Does that revolution succeed? Is that the parliament that the CIA helped overthrow to put the Shah in the, I guess, the 50s? That's as much as I know.
You're right. So I'm going to give you the shortest version of this, because the thing about this story is that it ends in victory. So 1909, it's April of 1909. The siege has been going on for 8 months now. That's it. There's no more food. We're all going to die. That's what the conclusion of the revolutionaries in Tabriz is. We're either going to die trying to break this siege, or we're going to die from the siege, so let's die breaking the siege. So on the morning of April 20th, they put together this 5-prong plan where the revolutionaries are going to try to burst out of the city at 5 different spots and break through this siege. And they had the equivalent of what are called Maxim guns, machine guns. The Shah's army did, these Russian-made weapons. And, the Maxim gun is a French-made weapon, but they bought it from the Russians. And Baskerville was the commander of one of those troops, the one that was going northeast. And in the midst of that, trying to break the siege, Baskerville gets shot, and he dies. But the international outcry from his death, the breaking of the siege ends up failing. It doesn't work. But again, like I was saying before, 100 Russians die, we don't care. 100 Armenians die, 100 Turks die, who cares? An American died. And now it's international news. And the response, it put so much pressure, not on the Shah couldn't care less, but it put so much pressure on the British and the Russians that they forced the Shah to pause the siege and to allow humanitarian aid to enter Tabriz. And the revolutionaries very cleverly used that pause to break out of Tabriz and march towards Tehran. And they get to Tehran, they pull the Shah from the throne, they send him into exile, they put his 12-year-old son on the throne, they rebuild the parliament. The first act of the newly elected parliament is to declare Howard Baskerville a hero and martyr of Iran. And then they rewrite the constitution, and Iran was a democracy ever since. Just kidding. And that's 1909. So you're like, holy cow, it worked. It happened. They did it. What the hell happened? Well, a few years later, this thing called World War I happened. I don't know if you heard about it. Absolutely devastates the region. Iran becomes carved into the Russian zone of interest and the British zone of interest. The war ends, and the Spanish flu shows up. Kills like 40% of the population of Iran. By the 1920s now, the early 1920s, the government is in collapse. Turns out, in a democracy, it takes a while to respond to humanitarian crises. The country is in the midst of starvation, and the British discover oil in the south. And this whole chaotic democracy is not conducive to the extraction of oil. So the British strike a deal with the military commander of the Cossack Brigade. And the Cossack Brigade is sort of the military elite of the Persian army. These are the Russian-trained military. This is the same force that was besieging Tabriz. And they find one of the higher commanders of the Cossack Brigade, a man who was there at the siege, a man who actually was commanding the post that Baskerville tried to break through, and that man's name is Reza Khan. And they tell Reza Khan, they basically encourage him to do a military coup, which he does. He rolls his troops into Tehran, brings the Shah, the son of the Shah, who was a useless figure anyway, throws him out, abolishes parliament, abolishes the constitution, declares a military coup, and then says, after a while, we'll have elections and we'll figure things out. But then a couple of years into it, the more he keeps talking to the British, the more he thinks to himself, I mean, elections and also a republic. So in 1924, he declares himself Reza Shah. And he becomes the first member of the Pahlavi dynasty. So this illiterate Cossack warrior just calls himself king, and Iran becomes a monarchy again. And so all of that revolution, all of the sacrifice, everything that happened gets completely thrown away. A new dynasty arises. Second World War starts. Reza Shah refuses to join the Allies. And in fact, he doesn't think Hitler's all that bad, actually. Hitler's got some good ideas, one of those kinds of people. And so the British said, we put you on this throne, we're removing you off this throne. So the British removed him from his throne and replaced him with his son. That son's name is Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. That is the man who was overthrown in 1979.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jessica.
Salam Reza.
Salam, John.
I just had a quick question. I noticed you referred to the language as Persian. Is there a reason why you didn't use Farsi?
Right, so Farsi is the Persian word for Persian. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Farsi is the Farsi word for Persian. It's actually the same exact word in linguistics. Any linguistics majors here? Right? Right, so F and P are interchangeable, right?
Yeah.
So they become the same. And so Farsi becomes Parsi, and then it becomes Persian. And so it's just, Persian is the Greek word for Farsi, and we get the English word from the Greek word.
Gotcha, thank you.
I was expecting questions about the nature of the divine, but
The nature of the divine.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that
it's not
for a minute.
happening. Any other questions?
This is great. I've never had this happen before. It's kind of
Great,
nice,
we have
honestly.
one.
It's really...
Yeah. Too shy.
Don't
hands
be shy,
just
don't be
popped
shy.
up.
One of the characters that fascinated me the most was the sort of charismatic turned alcoholic rebellion leader. If you could enlarge a little bit on him, I'd like that.
Sattar Khan?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, let me talk about a little bit about Sattar Khan, because yes, he is such an incredible character.
Mention the mustache.
Yes, that just unbelievable mustache, like the most perfect mustache you've ever seen. Sattar Khan was what's called a luti. Iranians have heard this phrase before because we still use it sometimes as a derogatory term, like, ugh, that luti over there. A luti is like a bandit, you know, like a street thug. But it's a very specific kind of street thug. Like the lutis in the early 20th century Iran were these like very refined, very well-dressed street thugs. And they would memorize poetry, and they saw themselves as like Robin Hood-like figures. You know, they would like steal from the rich and then occasionally give it to the poor. They were sort of the justice for those who could not claim justice. But they were essentially, they were criminals. That's what they were. They were like gangs of criminals, but with a very clear moral compass, you know, like who you steal from, who you do your crimes against. And that's what Sattar Khan was. He was he was a luti. He'd spent his entire life going in and out of prison. He was a horse thief. He was a thug. He spent a long time as a bodyguard for the crown prince, basically just like beating up people that the crown prince wanted him to beat up. And then he has this kind of spiritual transformation. And he disavows violence, and he moves back to Tabriz, and he becomes kind of like a legitimate businessman. You know, he's a horse trader. He raises horses and he sells them. And then the revolution happens. And the revolutionaries at first are just this kind of ragtag, it's like farmers and the cheesemonger and women, lots and lots of women who at first when they join the revolution, they cut their hair and they dress as men. And there's like all these really famous stories of like women who dressed as men and fought in the revolution. But then after a while, they're like, yeah, we're just gonna do it in the veil. We're fine. Like they just went out there as women, and it was really scandalous. You would see the pictures of like female revolutionaries who had died, and it was like a huge scandal in Europe and North America. And it's like, what kind of savages send women to do their fighting? And the women were like, yeah, we actually volunteered. And Sattar Khan sort of gets thrown into this role because at the time, Tabriz is all these different neighborhoods, and each neighborhood has its kind of neighborhood watch, like it's neighborhood guards, and they just kind of protect their neighborhood. And he was just sort of the protector of his neighborhood and just kind of fell into this role because he's so charismatic and he had just this ability to talk to people in like the colloquial Persian, not like the Persian that the preachers spoke in, but like the colloquial Persian. And people just gravitated towards him. And at a certain point in 1907, the Tabriz Council makes this decision. They're like, look, we need a leader. We need a commander. We need one person who's in charge of this ragtag group of people. And they choose Sattar Khan to be that person, and he's known as the people's commander, and he just rises to the call and becomes this like mythical figure who like constantly is getting shot, constantly. There's this really famous story in which the Shah's allies pay his servant to assassinate him, and his servant one day makes him some tea and gives him the tea and pulls out a pistol and shoots him in the stomach point blank. And Sattar Khan unknowingly removes the bullet from his stomach, kind of wraps himself up, and then the servant ran off and then forgave the servant. Like that's who he was. There was like postcards of Sattar Khan that they would make and send all over the country. Like people would sleep with him under his pillow. People would show up at Tabriz at all hours from all parts of the country, and they would say, I saw Sattar Khan in a dream and he called me to Tabriz. And so I'm here to fight alongside him. He was this like mythical character. However, again, he's not a military man. This is not his role. And as things start to get worse and worse and worse, he starts drinking. And by the time of Baskerville's death, he is a drunk. He is like a full-on alcoholic. In fact, there's an argument to be made that part of the reason why the final breaking of the siege failed is because of poor decision-making by him while he was just wasted. After the revolution, as you can imagine, he is a mythical hero, right? The guy from Tabriz that now we can see him. Here he's coming to Tehran, and here he is in the flesh. But he's not really a politician. They try to make him governor, and he's just terrible at it. He just doesn't know what he's doing at all. He's just not a man built for peace. And so they kind of give him a pension and they give him this house, and he just drinks himself to death at the end of his life. It's a really sad story at the end, but just an absolutely legendary character.
So we had Baskerville back then. And where we are today, we may need many more Baskervilles to, to break away from what is holding on to our nationality, to our dreams, to our freedoms, and all of that. Any reflections, projections as to, in Iran and many parts of the world, they do believe that if America united behind it, truly united, and did not have these hidden interests that still survive, along with the British and many others, and the Russians, and they all are exploiting the interests while the people of Iran suffer from status quo. So I wanted to see if you have any reflections on whether it would take another Baskerville or many Baskervilles to do what he did and bring some kind of hope to the people.
Yeah, in fact, part of the reason why I wrote this book was, to me, Baskerville is this model for, I think, how we should think of ourselves, right? It's funny that here we are in this, post-globalization, transnationalist world where we can, be in Europe in 8 hours, and yet what's happened is that our national identity has become even stronger. Our sense of trans community has become weaker, right? That we have this kind of conception that what happens over there is their problem and it's not our problem. And to have this 22-year-old kid 116 years ago come up with this obvious but novel notion that nationality is just the luck of where you were born. It means nothing at all. It's just this fake construct that was, placed upon you that, okay, you're American and you're Iranian. That means nothing. And that that what we really need to do is kind of break through that prejudice of nationality, right? That bigotry of creed, and to understand the humanity behind it. The notion that the suffering of one person anywhere in the world is the responsibility of all people everywhere in the world is something that we've kind of lost, I think, in the 21st century, particularly with all the problems we're having here at home. And to me, Baskerville represents this kind of other way of thinking, right? That it's a question that we need to ask ourselves as individuals, as a nation for sure, but certainly as individuals, which is like, what is our responsibility to other people who live outside of our borders? Do we have a responsibility to those who are clamoring for the most basic rights that we not just completely take for granted, but we preach constantly, at the top of our lungs, and yet don't do anything about? I think for Gen Z especially, this is a generation that's like looking at a planet on fire, and a broken political system that has no, certainly in the short term, hope of fixing itself. And I think sometimes when you're confronted with that, it makes you want to close in even further, right? It makes you go, well, then I'm just gonna think about what's mine, and I'm gonna build a wall around myself because everybody else is just nuts and everything else is on fire. And my hope is, at least, that a story like Baskerville's will give you a different reaction, that instead of closing in, instead of building a wall, I should strip myself of my privilege and my nationality and my religious identification and my race, and realize that the suffering of any one person anywhere in the world is the responsibility of everyone everywhere in the world, and I'm one of those people. It's the hope, So I think that's what I wanted to do with Baskerville. And not just here, but also in Iran. So I was sharing this with Jennifer, but I'll tell you guys this kind of wonderful story. The truth is that Baskerville today has been completely forgotten in Iran. My generation is probably the last generation that would have been taught about Howard Baskerville. All those streets I was telling you about, they've all been renamed. All those schools have been renamed. All those auditoriums, they're all renamed. His tomb is still in Tabriz, and it's still visited, but nowhere, near like it was. There's a beautiful golden bust of him and a painting of him and a statue dedicated to the constitutional revolution. But as I recently discovered, the docent who works there doesn't know who he is. That's amazing. The person paid there is not exactly sure who this bust of this American Christian kid is. And that is a crime. It is a shame. And so part of my goal was not just to resurrect Baskerville's name in America, but was to resurrect his name in Iran. And to that, I just found out a couple of weeks ago that this consortium of Americans and Iranians, with the permission of the landowner who owns the land where the tomb is, and the municipal government of Tabriz, and now they're applying for exemption from the Treasury Department's sanctions, because you can't do anything in Iran because they're under such sanctions. They are going to build this beautiful mausoleum over his tomb. A very famous Iranian architect has designed it, and construction is going to begin in the spring, in April, the anniversary of his death. And so hopefully, future generations will come to remember, who this person is. Who is this mausoleum for? There'll be information there. We're going to make this little kiosk and this kind of interactive thing there that will sort of tell Baskerville's story and who he was and what he meant to Iran, and just kind of revive a different impression of America, or Americans, I should say, in Iran. So I'm really excited about that.
I think that's the perfect place to close, but I know. I will say that, okay,
Okay, all right.
okay. What am I going to say to that? Exactly.
Here we go.
So the Islamic Republic is a brutally oppressive regime, right? It's held the Iranians captive for 44 years. It's the #1 executioner in the world per capita. It was executing at least 5 to 6 Iranians per day until January 1st of this year. And in the first 16 days of this year, it's executed 32, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's just a brutally oppressive regime. And I'm trying to piggyback off of something you had said maybe a question ago, in terms of what our role is in helping the Iranians, right? The freedom fighters are out in the streets sacrificing their lives for Iran. And one of them was literally executed just 2 days ago, Mohammad Ghobadli, 23-year-old woman life freedom protester. And so, sure, I think we have a responsibility, a moral obligation, and duty to help people all around the world. But when it comes to US politics specifically, not only has it not helped the Iranian people, but they had that $6 billion quote-unquote prisoner swap where they gave $6 billion for humanitarian aid, but we all know what that actually means. That's not going to the Iranian people, right? And then you had the $10 billion of unfrozen assets from Iraq that ended up going to the Islamic Republic. And then they've been lifting sanctions that has led to over $50 billion that has gone to the pocket of the Islamic Republic in continuous revenue. This is not just this past year, right? This is continuous revenue we're talking about. So I was wondering what your thoughts are in terms of what the US should be doing to address both the threat that the Islamic Republic poses to the world and help the Iranian people in their plight for freedom. And in addition to that, I was hoping you could also speak to the West's role in the revolution of 1979 in terms of the propaganda that led to the leftists and everybody to rise up against the Shah.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm so glad. This is a great place to end. First of all, 100%, you're absolutely right. The Islamic Republic is a brutal dictatorship. The only answer to the Republic is its absolute removal and its sending off to the dustbin of history. There is nothing that is, I think, more important to me as an individual, as an Iranian, and as a human being than the downfall of the clerical regime in Iran. It's what I pray for every day. I can't go back to Iran because they would kill me instantly. My children haven't been able to see their father's home country. I have countless cousins and uncles and aunts in Iran who are suffering every day because of this absolutely bloodthirsty and brutal regime, and it has to be removed. The question isn't should it be removed. The question is how. How do we do that? The answer of the United States government for 44 years has been sanction, containment, isolation. That's been a single note for 44 years. If we just sanction them enough, then the people will be so, they'll suffer so much that they'll have no choice but to rise up against their own government. How's that working out so far? If we contain them, if we just block them off from the rest of the world, right? Don't give them access to the free market economy. Don't give them access to the IMF. Don't give them access to the WTO. Don't give them access to the WHO. Then things will get so bad that it'll collapse and the regime will change. If we isolate them enough, right? If we pour our energies into promoting their isolation, then eventually they'll be so cut off from the rest of the world that the government will collapse and it'll go away. 44 years we've been doing the exact same thing, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat in office, and 44 years that government is further entrenched today than it has ever been. It's further from the possibility of removal today than it has ever been, which is horrifying. And this is despite the fact that there have been, I know we all remember the women's movement, you probably remember the Green movement. That's 2 of 15 massive uprisings that have occurred in Iran just in the last 2 decades alone. And every one of those uprisings have been crushed with absolute brutality by the government. And none of them have actually managed to put a dent into the regime itself. Why? Why is that? Well, listen, it is a fundamental truth of international relations and foreign policy that the more you isolate a country, the more the population has to rely for its most basic survival on its leaders. Why didn't anyone except the middle class come out during the Green movement? Because if they did, they wouldn't get their bread. And that's the only place they can get their bread. Why did the women's movement fundamentally fail to actually make any meaningful political change? Because the rest of the nation wouldn't take part in it, because again, if it's go out there and sacrifice myself, as so many young women did in order to promote change, or feed my children. When you have created a situation in which the population is utterly dependent for every aspect of their livelihood on their government, the idea of removing that government, as much as you loathe them, and make no mistake, the people of Iran fucking hate their government. And I don't mean the secular ones do, or the young ones do. Everyone does. Some of the biggest protests during the women's movement were in Qom, the religious capital of the country. Everyone hates this government. Everyone would like it to go, but it's not going anywhere because it is absolutely in charge. What happens in a sanctions regime is that the people suffer because they can't access medicine or food or the international markets. But guess who can access medicine, food, and the international markets? The people wearing the turbans. They have the Rolexes. They drive the BMWs. Do you think sanctions in any way, shape, or form affects them? It does not. It doesn't. They have everything that they need, everything that they want. And also, on top of that, they control the black market. Since the black market's the only way anyone else gets anything, guess who controls it? So the clerical regime has become this like economic elite. They're a kleptocracy, is what they are. They're a mafia, is what they are. They're not a religious group, they're a mafia. And that is a direct result of American foreign policy. Now look, I understand that there is a lot of emotional response to people who argue for a targeted sanctions regime instead of a blanket sanctions regime. Maybe instead of just sanctions upon the whole nation, you sanction the political leaders, the military leaders. I mean, that's just smart foreign policy. But I understand that, especially for Iranian Americans who have experienced that suffering, like I and my family have, that you think to yourself, I don't want to ease anything. I don't want to ease anything for these bastards. Well, you're not easing it for the bastards. Allowing the population to actually access the rest of the world is the only way to empower them to a place where they can actually make meaningful political changes. A tyrant stays in power by isolating his people. We have done the tyrant's work for him in Iran for 44 years. So you may disagree with me, and again, it's a perfectly valid disagreement. But I've got something on my side of the argument, which is what you are calling for, we've tried for 44 years. So maybe let's try something else, just anything else. I was a fervent supporter of President Obama's P5+1 nuclear negotiations. And the reason that I was a fervent supporter of that is because what it forced Iran to do to maintain what it wanted, which was billions of dollars of unfrozen assets, which again, you can say, well, all that does is go into the mullah's pocket. Okay, I'm not disagreeing with that. But what it forces you to do to maintain the flow of money is to actually abide by checks and balances. And it's those checks and balances that allow us to do something that we haven't been able to do in Iran for 4 decades, which is actually punish them for poor behavior. The way foreign policy works, which is all about maintaining interests, that's what foreign policy is. The way foreign policy works is that you reward a nation for doing things that are in your interest, and you punish them for doing things that aren't. But if you have removed the possibility of any reward, and all you have is punishment, and by the way, you've already done all you can do. There's no more to sanction. The sanctions are absolute and complete. There's nothing we can do to punish Iran for killing children on the street. Literally nothing. We have no say, no control, no influence over it at all. The best that we can do is beg our European partners to do something about it, or try to do something in the UN, or maybe get Russia, not anymore, but maybe get Russia to do something about it. Why? Because Europe, Russia, China actually have interdependent relationships with Iran. They can punish Iran by taking something away. This policy has done nothing but entrench this government deeper into power. And even if you disagree with me, let's try something else. Let's try one other thing. That's all.
I think...
Can I just follow up on that really quick?
No, we need to finish right now. I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight. I really appreciate this. It was such a pleasure to see so many people here for a conversation about Iranian history. Reza, I want to thank you tremendously for your time and your generosity. So please join me in thanking Reza.